Hello, fellow chess player. On today's episode of Chess for Pandas, we'll continue our discussion of beating the Ponziani opening. So, without further ado, let's get into it. So, in the previous episode, we saw the Ponziani opening after e4, e5, knight f3, knight c6, and c3. Here, there were two main moves, d5 and knight f6. I recommended knight f6. And after the moves d4, knight e4, he had a look at knight takes e5 and d takes e5, but d5 is obviously the main move. And here I suggested that we sacrifice our c6 knight with the move bishop to c5. Now this is the Vukovic Gambit or the Fraser defense, like I previously mentioned. And in the previous video, we had a look at everything except d takes c6. So, which was basically bishop e3 because that's the main threat right now. So over here, in this video, we're going to look at the critical move where white accepts the sacrifice. So d takes c6. Now after d takes c6, we execute our threat, as to say. We take the pawn with check, the king moves up, and we drop the bishop back. Now the reason for dropping the bishop back is obviously we want to play knight to f2, forking the queen and the rook. Now over here, there are four main moves that white has played. So the main move here is queen to d5. Now queen to d5 is going to attack the knight, is going to threaten this particular fork here also. But that move requires some amount of memorization and it requires some amount of depth in analysis. So that is what we are going to do in the final video of the series. But today we're going to look at a lot of the moves that white plays which are not queen to d5. And what could they be? So these are the main moves. It's bishop to e3, a c takes b7, and a c takes d7 check. So now let us look at all of them in turn. Let's start with the worst one first, c takes d7 check. Now we don't want to exchange the queens, so bishop takes d7 it is. Knight is still threatening to go to f2. Bishop e3 seems to be the most logical way to deal with this. But after we chop the bishop and the king is dragged to the e3 square, here is a move that I want you to remember. It's a very typical move that happens in a lot of variations of the Vukovic Gambit, and it is a move that will serve you well if you can remember to play it and when to play it. The move is queen f6. The queen f6 has the obvious threat of queen f4 check, where because of the knight right now, the king can't actually go back to the f2 square. So it will be forced to be displaced, either block the bishop after king e2 or come on to the d file or something like that. The problem, immediate issue with queen f6 seems to be, what about just king takes e4? And here we are going to play a move which is absolutely fantastic. Reminds me of the Traxler attack in the two knights defense. It's just castle. The white king is so hopelessly exposed in the middle that this move is not just a good move, it's completely winning for white, for black. And over here, the basic threat is to move the bishop and essentially just grab the queen, right? That's the main threat of this position. So let's see two tries. What if the king just moves out of a light square so that there's no discovered check? Perfect, not a problem. We still keep checking the king, first with queen b6. One thing to remember here is that we did not play queen h6 check. And the reason for that is we don't want the king to go back to f2. And that's why queen b6 check seems to be quite important. And now coming back onto a light square will obviously cause the same check again and losing of the queen. So blocking with the knight seems logical. After e takes d4, c takes d4, rook h8 check, and king f2, I don't really think white can actually survive this position. The engine recommends bishop c6, but rook e4 seems to be good enough as well. After something like knight c3, rook takes d4, queen f4, rook e4 check, and that's it. king cannot move to g3 and it will be dusted. Blocking with the queen is nonsense because it's just queen e3 mate. So this is what can happen if white just takes the knight after queen f6. But there is something else that we can also do, right? So let's say even after king takes and castle, what if the king doesn't move to e3, but we simply block this particular rook's eyes, let's say, onto the queen by just playing knight b to d2? Well, it's still not enough. We play bishop b5 anyway, and now you can see the reason for that. The rook and the bishop control almost all the squares, and the queen simply has to come to f4 to deliver checkmate, and it would basically be game over. Uh, White is completely busted in this situation. A move, let's say like g3, preventing queen f4, doesn't really work because of queen g6 check. The king moves back, and I hope you can remember what we do here. We prevent the king from going back into his huddle on f2 by giving queen b6 check. And sure, you can interpose with the knight, but you can also come down here because now the discovered check of the bishop is no longer winning the queen because there's a knight on d2 now. But here comes the reason for this queen maneuver of queen g6, queen b7, or queen b6 is to actually remove the f5 pawn. So f5 check, king f5, or even king takes e5, it wouldn't really matter. After just a couple of more checks, here white king will be checkmated. In this position, if you go to the d file, obviously king d4 or king d5, queen d6 would be made here. So anyways, taking the knight is not something that white can get away with, but what if they just continue developing with something like knight b d2? Knight d2 seems to be a good move because it prevents any mishappenings on the d file. It's threatening the knight right now, and it's developing a piece, so it seems like a pretty good move. But what do we do here? We again castle. And the reason for that is very simple. After, let's say, knight takes e4, again, all of these tactics are working in unison. So if you remember some key ideas in such positions, you can actually find it very useful. And you don't have to rely on memorization of very specific moves. You have to remember a few key moves and ideas, and you can probably play the position. After queen b6, obviously you cannot drop to a white light square because of this particular check. Transposing or interposing with the knight seems the most logical one, but here I wouldn't recommend that you immediately capture it, although you could if you want, but I don't really think this would be the best course of action. We should just keep increasing the pressure with rook at g8. Obviously the knight is pinned, so it's not going anywhere. We don't have to capture it immediately. The rook puts extremely unpleasant pressure on the king with the e file. And let's have a look at one of the moves. I mean, king f2 is logical. You can go back. The best move according to the engines is king f2 and knight d6 check. But in all of these positions, white is losing the material and we are getting back the material with interest. I want to look at another try that white can have is to go queen b3 to exchange off this particular queen. After takes, and queen h6. Okay, we don't want to, like, white could go back, obviously, but they lose the knight. So what if white gets greedy and goes king f3? Well, here, I don't think white can survive this kind of assault. After bishop g4, if the king takes, then it's mated in a very short order. If it doesn't take and goes back, then why didn't you go back before? After rook e4, let's play through a few more moves. h3, queen d2 check, king g1, queen takes d4 check, king h2, rook e3, queen c2, and now this amazing move, bishop e6. But don't worry, even if you never find this move, this position is completely winning for black. We just have to keep making threats and keep playing active moves. And over here, we are not even a piece down or anything or a pawn down. In fact, we are a pawn up in this, or 2 pawns up in this particular situation. So it doesn't really matter. What I just want to show you a cute little tactic after rook c1. So rook c1 threatens the mate on c7, but here we have, if you want to find it out, I'll give you some time. You can think about it or pause the video, but rook takes h3. Such a sweet move. After gh3, queen f4, king g1 check, queen e3 check, king h2, and rook d2. That should be that. So this is something that can happen to white if they go for this entire c takes d7 variation. Now let's have a look at the other variations. Now, before looking at bishop e3, which is the main subject of the video, let's just quickly go and check the c takes b7 variation. This is very similar to the c takes d7 variation. We have to capture back with the bishop. The threat on f2 is still alive, so bishop e3 seems to be the most common thing to deal with it. And now I'm pretty sure you can guess what happens. We chop chop and we play queen f6, right? So the compensation is very similar to the previous line. The difference being the knight is no longer en prise because the bishop on b7 actually prevents that, and we still can castle kings, queenside or kingside, and throw our pawns up. Let's go back and look at the main meat of the chapter, which is the bishop e3 variation. After bishop e3, one thing to notice here is the the c pawn hasn't really captured any of the pawns, so it hasn't gone c takes or this. The problem here is if we try to go with the same variation of chop the bishop and queen f6, even after king e4, since the pawn hasn't really captured b7 or d7, we are still a few moves away from getting the bishop out and bringing a rook to the d file. So it'll take us a lot of moves to do that. And in the meantime, white can organize a pretty solid defense. And that is the reason why it's not really advisable before white has captured one of the pawns to actually go for the queen f6 variation. And that is an important point that we must remember. So what do we do after bishop e3? Well, we play b takes c6, and we introduce another threat here, which is bishop a6. And bishop a6 is a new diagonal that has opened up, and the white king is sitting comfortably there. Here there are several moves that we can play. Let's look at all of them in turn. Let's look at a very natural looking move, which is queen to d3. Now, queen to d3 obviously is threatening the knight, so we play pawn to d5, simply protecting the knight. And if white continues with the development, let's say with knight b to d2, here is an important point that I would like to mention. Whenever the queen's knight is coming to d2 to trade our own knight, we never capture the knight. That is one thing that we should never do. We don't want to ease the white development. The problem in a lot of these variations for white is that the pieces basically don't have enough breathing room and they're stepping on each other's toes. And we don't want to make it easier for white by exchanging pieces off. And because of that, we want to suffocate him and basically take up as much space as possible. In fact, our entire pawn armada here is doing a pretty good job of suffocating the white pieces. So here is the point that I would like to mention. So whenever you see the move knight b to d2, you don't capture the knight. You essentially go back to either knight f6 or to knight d6. How do you decide where to go? Another rule of thumb is if the d pawn has already moved, it makes sense to go back to knight d6 because your queen still has access to this diagonal and it will be more active here. But if the pawn has not moved to d5, then going back knight d6 would actually block the pawn, and that would not be good. And if in such situation, you're probably better off dropping to f6. So you still have the option of playing the pawn to d5. So after knight to b to d2, knight b to d2, we can go back knight d6. And let's say if to release the cramp, he chops the bishop off. Here we don't even take it back. We simply play e4, not capturing the bishop back because obviously we are threatening the queen. After something like queen e3, a takes b6, the knight is still threatened, so the knight moves. If we play c6, let's say the knight goes back, we castle, and you can already see how menacing our pawns look over here. And all of the white pieces are actually sleeping. The two knights are cramped for space and they're not really having any good squares to go to. The pawns cannot directly be attacked, and it's difficult to undermine them right now because they have the support of the pieces. So because of this, it's a pretty sad situation for white. But let's continue. Let's go on with a few of the variations. Let's say we want to bring the bishop out. So let's move to king d1, f5. We can already start to see how menacing these pawns are. And I keep saying menacing because I don't really know any other word to describe these pawns. Bishop e3, f4. We keep going forward. Queen g1. Now, instead of immediately playing something like e3, which will give the knight a nice home to perch on f3, we keep increasing the tension. So our pawns are looking as formidable as they are. They should be in green color. So they're looking very formidable, but our rooks are still not connected, right? So let's play bishop d7. Simply connecting the rooks now after the queen moves. And let's say after something like b3, the white plan is to tuck the king away here because we don't have a dark squared bishop. It will be difficult to hound the king here. But queen f6. We don't have a bishop. We have something better. We have the queen. And after something like c4, we can't obviously take the rook because the knight protects the rook, but d4. And I think we can stop the analysis here. It's just really menacing what these particular pawns can do. Queen f1 and let's say d3. We take, queen takes d3. It's basically sacrificing a piece to just get some breathing space. Bishop f5, queen f3, queen b2. Let's say rook c1 and rook a2. I don't really think that white can survive this position at all. So this is just one of the ways that can go really wrong for white. So this is the kind of fun you can have in this particular variation. But let's go back. Let's say instead of queen d3, let's say they go queen a4. Now the idea of queen a4 is, okay, you're still threatening the knight, but at the same time you're also preventing the bishop from utilizing this diagonal. So what do we do with this particular situation? Well, we can't really go d5 because of queen takes c6. That's one thing that this has prevented. So what we can actually do is go back with the knight. Now here is something that I have already mentioned, is if the knight ever have to move, right? So the knight is currently threatened. It can't really go here because it doesn't want to chop it and chop off because this knight will be useful. White is cramped. So we don't want to trade the knight. We want to preserve the knight. And when the d pawn hasn't moved, we always know that we preserve the knight with knight f6. Obviously, these are guidelines, and you should always have a thorough look at the concrete elements of the position. So don't just take my advice blindly. Do some calculation. It's chess for a reason. So after bishop takes b6, which is very logical, you cannot really take back with the a pawn because the rook is hanging. So we take back with c takes b6. And now obviously the knight can't take because of the queen coming to e7. So let's say white keeps on developing. Knight b to d2, we castle. Rook e1. Finally, I think white can castle by hand. But here we go, e4. And after something like knight g5, d5. And that same menacing pawn structure is coming back again. And if you think that queen takes c6 will make any difference, it really doesn't. Bishop g4 check, king f2, e3 check, and after rook e3, bishop d7 check, which is just amazing. It's a vacation tactic. So we vacate the square g4 for the knight to give this deadly fork, and at the same time we are attacking the queen. So after something like queen b7, knight g4 check, king e2, we still don't take the rook. Queen takes g5. Although taking the rook will also be decent, but we can go here. Let's say they try to preserve the rook with rook g3. We have the other rooks coming in, king d1, and it seems like white is escaping, but it's not. Knight f2 check, king c2, bishop f5 check, king b3, and queen takes d2. I don't really think that we should go any further. White is completely hounded, and we're not even material down at the moment, and it's simply winning for us. So that is the kind of fun you can have in the queen a4 variation. So now let's move back and look at something else. What about knight b to d2? You know what to do after knight to b to d2. It's knight that's being threatened, right? So we don't want to exchange it because that will release the cramp that white has. We haven't really played d5. If we had played d5, we'll go back to knight d6. But since we don't, what do? Knight f6. That's essentially what we do. And the variations are very similar to the other moves that you'll see. You just have to remember a few critical key ideas. So let's say if queen a4, we are already transposing into the previous variation where we can essentially just castle. Let's go to the main move after all of this, which is bishop takes b6. After bishop takes b6, we take back with the a pawn. There are several moves that white can play. Let's look at a few bad ones. Knight takes e5 is not good. After castle, let's say queen d4, rook e8, queen takes e4, rook a5. I think it's already pretty evident that this position is really bad for white. Knight takes e5 doesn't really solve any problems, and if you want to go after grabbing pawns at this particular stage of the game, you are just asking for it. What about queen d3 in this particular position? Well, d5. We already know, and in fact now the threat is even more serious. We couldn't go bishop a6 directly because of the move c4. So now to preempt that, we have gone d5, and now bishop a6 is a serious threat. So let's say if the king tries to move out with king e1, we castle, and let's say they continue developing. What did I say? We don't trade the knight, we go back because we have already played d5. Now we can drop the knight back to d6, and now we are threatening e5, queen e3. We continue our pawn assault, and we can and yeah, white can never really take this because of the pin that the king will be in, and we'll recover this piece pretty easily. So bishop e2, e4, knight g5, h6, and you can see how badly the knights are being treated here. We can't really take because we won't be spoiling the structure enough because the queen will be able to take back. But we just keep harassing the queen. d4, we are still moving forward. Bishop g4, trying to release the tension by some exchanges. No, queen h4. Knight f2, protecting the bishop in some sense, but e3, and that's all. So you can see in a lot of these variations, the pawns are doing a really good job of pushing back white. But you can also see that the queen, despite being the strongest piece on the board and being very agile, is actually being hit by tempo moves and just moving here and there and letting black develop an initiative. That's a very common theme that you're going to see here. Black is a piece down, so this is the kind of compensation that he's aiming for. So this was the queen d3 move, let's say, and let's we already showed you the d5 move, but let's say instead of going king e1, let's say he goes king d1. Well, simple tactic. Knight f2. what if they go knight takes e5, right? Now the thing is, this threat of bishop a6, they want to meet it with c4. That's the whole idea of this knight takes e5 move. But it's everything is hanging by a thread here for white, so it's no surprise that he's going to lose pretty soon. After queen f6, we are threatening the knight, and if we chop off the knight, then this threat becomes real. Queen d4 and c5. We are constantly moving the queen away from the defense of the knight. After queen takes d5, queen f2 check, supported by the knight, of course. King d1, rook d8. And unfortunately, like Toshar used to say, the fatty won't survive. So yep, I really don't think white can survive this position. So knight takes e5 is also not good. So we saw this queen d3 variation is not really promising. We already had a look at the knight e5 variation, where we know that the two rooks can deal a lot of damage. Let's have a look at just a simple development with knight b to d2. This seems quite logical because you're not putting your queen in the way of bishop a6 diagonals, and you just want to continue with the development. And obviously we know whenever the knight is threatened, we play knight f6, right? We don't want to do knight d3, knight d6 here. So after king f2, he's trying to go back to his huddle, queen to e7. And the threat is not so much queen c5 check. The threat is actually just simply marching the e pawn up the board, now that it's protected by the queen. Something like bishop d3 wouldn't really work, because after check, and if you move back, let's say to g1, we have this check here. So let's say if you move forward with king g3, we have this move again with queen to f6. Now, instead of the knight being on e4, it's actually on g4, which is preventing the king going back to f2, right? Another thing I wanted to mention is I would like to play f5 here, so that I'm protecting the knight with another pawn, and there are a lot of variations coming, and there are a lot of threats coming in. We'll see this in another variation when white decides to not play bishop d3 but play bishop c4. But in this variation, it's not possible, but we have this beautiful queen f6 move again. Let's have a quick look at what happens if king takes. It's not going to survive, as you can guess. We give a check. If the king goes up, we simply, if the king goes to h3, we simply go d5. And I don't think mate is avoidable in that situation. So let's say if he goes king h5, we simply play g6. Bishop takes and takes g6 is mate. So the king can't really take the knight. And if it doesn't take the knight, what can you do to prevent queen f4? Because queen f4 is a pretty serious threat. One other thing that you can try is knight takes e5, although I don't really believe in it. After queen f2 check, if you simply move the king, I take the knight. And if you chop the knight off, we again get the same demolition that we have d6, king h5, f4. Now this is a pretty sweet move, and sometimes in a lot of these open games you can see that sometimes you should not go for like obvious checks. Sometimes just playing quiet moves like queen f4 can do the trick, because now you're just threatening a single g6 checkmate. Knight to g4 can be played, but in all of these situations I'm just showing you variations. They're not exhaustive by any means, but it's pretty simple that white cannot survive this kind of a position. Let's say something like bishop g4, queen g4, and queen h6 mate. So this is the kind of carnage that white will be subjected to in these lines. So let's say if they don't go bishop to d3, but they go to bishop to c4. Again, knight check, and you cannot go back to g1 like we just saw. If you come to g3, now since the bishop is not eyeing the f5 square, we can actually go f5. Another point is after something like h3, trying to go back, we have this amazing check, f4. The king cannot go back because the knight actually controls both the squares. The king is in check. He has to take, and after d5, h5, and queen f6, there is no way to prevent queen h6 mate. So that's another pretty variation here. So after queen a7, and white's position seems to be in shambles. And that's the reason why this entire variation with bishop takes b6 is not really playable also. So in the next and final episode of this particular series, we'll have a look at what happens when white plays the main move, which is queen d5, which threatens the knight, of course, and also threatens this pawn. So we'll have a look at that in the next and probably the final episode of Beating the Ponziani with the Vukovic Gambit. So if you like that carnage, consider subscribing so you don't miss out on the other opening videos that I do. And also have a look at these two other videos, which I think you might find interesting.